Good afternoon. We're here this afternoon to talk about efficacy and impact. I think everybody who's coming to this conference cares a lot about those topics. We're lucky today to be joined by a group of just terrific panelists, people who've built some of the most exciting and impactful companies in the education sector in the US. We'll start with a round of introductions. If Jonathan, Janine, Trace, and Ray would talk a little bit about their backgrounds and what led you into the education sector and the companies you work with. I'll start. I'm John Rogers. I'm the education partner for the RISE Fund, which is a global social impact fund where we focus on education, healthcare, financial services, and energy. We've been quite active in the education sector, supporting companies like Dreambox Learning, Renaissance Learning, EVERFI, and InStride. And I've been doing this work for the better part of a couple decades, starting with companies like Sylvan Learning Systems and Strayer 20 years ago. So Jonathan, take it away. Tell us a little bit about your background and about InStride.
Sounds good. Thanks, John. Jonathan Lau, I'm the Chief Learner Officer at InStride, which basically means that I spend all my time trying to make sure our corporate partners and their learners are successful. InStride, we're here to go to help corporations deliver business and social impact by helping them deliver and give kind of meaningful and transformative career-boosting education to their workforce. A little bit about me. I've actually been a huge beneficiary myself of both our higher education system, but also of workforce education programs. Whether that's, at Microsoft, I was part of a marketing leadership recruit program, or at McKinsey, they gave me a mini MBA. So I've always got my corporations or the employers to actually pay for my education for some reason. And now I said, well, you know what? We should really go figure out a way to go make more corporations do that for more of their employees. And really, I ended up in education, having the opportunity to work at Cengage, which is, obviously one of the higher ed publishers, and help them transform from print to digital, and from focusing on kind of instructors to focusing on learners. And as part of that, we launched Cengage Unlimited, which was kind of the first of its kind subscription for textbooks. And I also had the opportunity to work in the skills business and run the skills business there. And when I ran the skills business, I had a chance to work with a lot of employers and realized very quickly that the best way to actually create impact for learners was to work with corporations who ultimately both have the funding, but also have the motivation and drive and need a skilled workforce.
Janine?
Thanks, John. I'm Janine Walker-Caffrey. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Reading Plus, soon to become part of the Dreambox Learning family. And Reading Plus is an adaptive reading assessment and instructional program. We help students develop their silent reading fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, reading stamina, and motivation. And a bit about myself, I got into education as a special education teacher, mainly because I really hated school growing up, and I thought maybe somebody should do it a little bit better. And that led me into school leadership, and then eventually joined the EdTech community about 7 years ago. Really happy to be here.
Thanks.
Say my name. No, sorry. I am Trace Urdan, Managing Director at Tyton Partners. Tyton is a professional services firm focused on the education sector with practices both in strategy consulting and in investment banking. My background is I've spent, prior to joining Tyton about 4 years ago, I had a 20-year career as an equity research analyst covering education companies for various Wall Street firms, most recently Credit Suisse. I've had people talking at me about this topic for probably all of that time. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Ray?
Ray Martinez, president and co-founder at EVERFI. We work with about 30,000 K through 12 public schools across the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. We deliver digital curriculum really focused on the missing learning layer in education. When we started the business 13 years ago, we really focused on personal finance and financial education for young adults, particularly at the high school and middle school audience. We thought it was really important that we teach young adults about savings, budgeting, how you navigate college, really important decisions around your personal finance. Our business model is pretty unique in which all of our platforms are free to public schools. We go out and we partner with large foundations and private corporations that license that software on a multi-year basis. So we have about 1,000 foundations and corporate partners that are paying the full cost of the platform for teachers in the classroom. As it relates to personal finance and financial literacy in this country, there are a few factors that are going on. Number one is you have a number of unfunded mandates in states all across the country. So there are about 40 states today that have some type of standalone requirement or recommended requirement in order to graduate from high school. So we're filling a really important gap for teachers in the curriculum where they can use this blended learning tool to meet these unfunded mandates. Number two, there's a lot of emerging academic research that is showing that these types of interventions are effective for students. George Washington University just came out with a meta-analysis looking at the effectiveness of financial literacy, and it's very encouraging what we're seeing there. The other factor is that if you look at the racial wealth gap, the Federal Reserve came out with a study that said, white families have 8 times more wealth than black families, 5 times more wealth than Latinx families, a trend that has persisted since the 1970s. Now, we're not going to solve that with financial literacy and financial education intervention, but it can help. And there are a lot of emerging topics that continue to put a ton of pressure on students and families. Number one, how do you navigate the decisions around college? How do you navigate student loans? John, you asked, why am I doing this? I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. I went to Bowdoin College in Maine, go Polar Bears. But I would have never gone to a private university like Bowdoin had my dad and I not sat at the dinner table and filled out the FAFSA form together. And I was lucky because it was very clear that I was going to go to college and my sister was going to college. So what role can technology play in scaling to make sure that every student, regardless of where they live, has access to this type of information? And then you look at the modern digital banking system, peer-to-peer payments, crypto. There are a lot of emerging topics that students and families have to navigate in a really complex world. So we want to leverage technology, leverage the private sector to do that. And sorry for the long introduction, but I've got one more thing I want to talk about, which is one example of how this plays out real time. For the last 5 years, we've been partnering with MassMutual and the MassMutual Foundation. We've deployed a digital financial education curriculum called Future Smart. That curriculum has reached 2 million students. 43% of those students are BIPOC, 41% are low to moderate income. And I know this is about efficacy, and so we just completed a 3-year independent study really looking at the impact this type of digital curriculum has for students all across the country.
So I appreciate, Ray, you bringing up the research because that is one of the things we're focused on here today. And we'll come back to that. I do want to turn to Janine. You've got a pretty big research department. And just maybe you can give a little bit of the history of Reading Plus and the research in which it was grounded when it was founded in the first place.
Sure. Well, Reading Plus actually started as a research company way back in the 1930s. So we're kind of an old EdTech. We were EdTech before EdTech was a thing. And it was started by the Taylor family, known as Taylor Associates, way back then. And the Taylor family pioneered a bunch of different devices that would help them understand how kids were learning to read and why some people were better readers than others. And in the 1980s, Stan Taylor developed a device called the Visigraph. And it was really the first device that was able to use eye tracking to determine how well a child was reading. And that evolved eventually into something we call now the guided window, and it's a patented part of the Reading Plus product. And the guided window allows the student to move through a text in a very clear way. It's kind of a digitization of what really good teachers do when they're teaching reading. If you take an index card or a little card with a window in it, there's all kinds of physical devices that we use to do that, and the guided window does that digitally on a screen for the student and helps them very, very quickly develop their silent reading fluency.
Yeah, it's a terrific, and you do ongoing research, which we'll come back to in a minute. But Jonathan, why don't you talk about some of the research and some of the data that led to the founding of InStride?
Sure. So I think we're very lucky. So InStride actually launched 2.5 years ago here at ASU+GSV. So it's amazing how time flies. And really, InStride was created by actually our friend here, the Rise Fund, and John did a lot of tremendous amount of work with our amazing partner ASU to really go create this company InStride to scale kind of what Starbucks was doing in the Starbucks SCAP program, the College Achievement Plan. And what we saw from all that work that Starbucks did with ASU was that there was a way for a forward-leaning corporation to invest in their people in a meaningful way, and that delivers both social impact, so brand recognition, really helping people graduate, helping people drive lifelong kind of outcomes and better pay, but also business impact. Higher retention, lower cost of recruiting, more promotions, and kind of building a talent pipeline. So what was really exciting was, I think the whole genesis of what we did with InStride was we saw that there was a way, there was a path that said that you didn't have to have this sleepy benefit sitting somewhere that you actively didn't want people to use if you're a corporation, or that you just wanted to buy a library of video content just to go say that, hey, I got something. But that if a company actually believed and understood the power of investing in their people and investing in education, that you can really deliver these amazing impact and amazing outcome. And that's what we've been doing. So we've been working with more partners to go continue to scale this, to go launch more of these programs and help them measure both ROI, so all the tangible hard numbers and dollars, but also kind of what their social impact is and how that kind of, what the impact that they're bringing back to society.
Can you say more about the data you collect? Because you've got both the corporate partners and the academic partners. If you don't have access to the data, it's hard to measure the outcome. So how do you navigate those relationships, and how do you get a hold of data?
Yeah, no, I think it's the nice thing is because we're kind of a B2B2C, so to speak. So we do get to interact with the learner. So one of the things we do is because the corporation in many cases is funding the education, we get the learner to consent to go share that information across the whole ecosystem. And so once they consent, we're able to, our wonderful academic partners, share some of their data back with us. We then can basically go mine that, go actually report it, pull it together in reasonable forms, and then present that back to both the corporate partner and the learner. And then what the corporate partner can go do is actually match that back, and we help them with this as well, but match that with their HRIS information. And so now you can start doing more things like, somebody that participates in education versus somebody that does not. What does that look like? What's the power of education? How does that deliver? What's the difference in your recruiting costs before you launch the program versus after you launch the program? So that's the kind of stuff that now we're able to do, is marrying both the corporate data and the academic partner data.
And how about so with the academic partners, they're also watching the completion of the students in the programs. Are they able to talk to the corporations, or how does that communication work?
Usually that's through us because we do have a number of different academic partners that we work with a corporation, so we don't want to have kind of one-on-one. It just makes it a little more complicated. But we do help broker some of those conversations. But also in many cases, because we have multiple corporations, we get to see and work with our academic partners to see, are there differences across different corporations? And is it because of demographics, et cetera? And so we actually work with our academic partners to take a look at the different populations, what's going on, why are they successful, less successful, and how much are they going through. So we look at that all the time and have those conversations with them.
I like the idea of motivating the corporations by telling them they're falling behind on their benchmarks. But Janine, how about the data that you're able to collect? Because you're doing quite a bit of research on an ongoing basis.
We are, and so then the most important piece of research for us is around reading proficiency, and so we call it comprehension-based silent reading fluency. And so we want to know that students can read silently at a rate that is appropriate for their age and grade level, and we want to know that they're understanding what they read. It's been really fascinating during the pandemic to kind of put that together with other research, other data that we collect. And we collect data on student motivation for reading, on their growth mindset, on their confidence as a reader, and on the amount of things that they read. And probably no surprise to everybody, some of those things have had some pretty significant trends during the pandemic. So what we've learned is that growth mindset has really slowed down. Students are declining in their ability to increase their growth mindset. So normally during a school year, as students progress through the school year, we see growth mindset increasing. We're not seeing that so much during the pandemic. Normally during a school year, we see students increasing in the volume of the reading materials that they engage in. Not so during the pandemic. And what we know for sure is that the more kids read and the more they engage with interesting text, And the more they engage in comprehension questions around those texts, the better readers they'll become. So as their reading volume has declined and how their belief in their own growth mindset has declined, we have experienced a real learning lag of about half a school year this year. So we're really concerned about that, like everybody else, and working hard with schools to improve that in the coming school year. And I'll add one more thing if I can. The really important part in developing that growth mindset is making sure students can see their own data. And I have seen that firsthand with my granddaughter, Jane, who is now an avid Reading Plus user. And she sees on the dashboard every day how many words she has read, and it's in the thousands. And when you think about a 7-year-old saying, wow, I've read 7,000 words, it's a pretty exciting thing to see. So she can see her rate improving, she can see the volume of words increasing, and she sees her scores on comprehension. It's really critical that we let students and parents understand their own data and really own their own data.
Gamified reading.
It is.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in that. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Trace, but first, Ray, you referenced several studies while you were giving your introduction. It's quite striking that you're able to engage in so much research. So maybe you can say more about that, because one of the dilemmas, I think, for EdTech companies is, well, a study is expensive, takes a long time, you've got to get it set up, and how do you get it going? So say more about how you're able to participate in research on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I would love to do that, but Janine, my first job after college was teaching early reading. And I remember cutting out index cards with holes in them so students could track the words, and it's amazing you can do that through the software now, which is fantastic. But as it relates to our research in personal finance and financial literacy for young adults, I talked about the MassMutual partnership, where you have 2 million students that have gone through that course, 6,000 middle schools every year use the platform. The first area that we looked at is, like, what's the gap in the curriculum as you look at state standards? And one of the things that we found as we looked at the academic research is that students, when they're turning 11, 12, and 13 years old, and I don't know if any of you have an 11-year-old or 12-year-old or 13-year-old, I have an 11-year-old, they go through what's called financial socialization. So they're really starting to develop their norms, their values, their relationship with money. But there wasn't any great digital curriculum that teachers are using in the classroom. So since we've built this trusted infrastructure, we're able to survey about 50,000 teachers across the network who said, we need something for our middle school students. So we developed a 4-hour co-curricular experience that teachers could use. It's available in English and Spanish. Then we embedded a 3-year independent research study. We hired the University of Massachusetts, the Donahue Institute. We wanted to look at 2 factors. One, through an observational study, how do teachers use a free digital resource in the classroom? Do any of the factors in terms of what class they use it in, what period of time, does it impact student outcomes? And what we learned from that study is it didn't matter how they used it as long as they used it. And the second part was a quasi-experimental design. I had to ask my research team 3 times what that meant, but we've got a great research team, Dr. Dan Zapp and Meg Moore. But we had a control group where we gave a group of students the intervention, another group of students did not receive the intervention. And what we found was the students who took the digital curriculum made statistically significant more progress across a variety of different topics, savings, budgeting, planned behaviors, and that was regardless of race, gender, parent education level, and socioeconomic background. So we've moved the needle on students can improve knowledge gain, but that's not enough. We want to go beyond that, which is, can you impact attitudes and behaviors through this type of digital curriculum? And so we're going to start a 4-year study. We're going to follow students from 8th grade to 12th grade. We have 350 families sign up for this study, but we couldn't do that, John, without the private sector. And I'll go back to the business model that we have, where this is all being funded by our foundation partners and the corporate partners who are licensing our software, licensing our research team and our network, over 3, 4, 5, in some cases 10-year period. MassMutual's commitment is over 10 years. So we want to move the needle beyond just understanding of these concepts.
So staying on that point for a second, It's clear that it's clear that EVERFI cares about the outcomes and measuring the outcomes, but just say more about who else cares about the outcome. So are the corporate partners asking for the research? Are the foundation partners asking for the research?
I mean, absolutely. You know, we started in high school financial literacy, and I think as we've grown that network, we've learned a couple different things. That right now, for our corporate partners that we work with, scale matters, student outcomes matter, and data and reporting matters, because a lot of our partners are using the results, the impact reports that we collect on an aggregate level for real regulatory requirements. A lot of our partners are financial institutions where under the Community Reinvestment Act, they have to deploy investments and services in low to moderate income communities. We have a network of 30,000 schools, and the majority of students who access our software are low to moderate income students. So the data, the reporting, the knowledge gain, you know, our banks are using in front of the OCC, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and others. And so they do care about outcomes.
Well, that's good to hear. I'd be interested, Trace, to hear your perspective, because you've been following the sector for many years and writing research on many of the companies. When you think about outcomes and data and reporting and accountability, do you think accountability is going up or staying about the same? How do you view that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the K-12 system, we've had accountability structures for years. You know, I was covering this space through No Child Left Behind, right? No Child Left Behind was all about accountability structures, and it's created an ecosystem of measurement and research and high quality research, and I think all of that is positive. You know, the question becomes sort of what purpose that serves, and I think government has one purpose for it. But what I think we've seen more recently, and I frankly find more encouraging, is that I think we're kind of breaking out of that measurement of efficacy as a academic exercise, and there's more and more pressure from the public on what is our education, what are the more important outcomes for our education system. And it's hard to generalize across K-12 and higher ed. I think the tensions in each of those systems is really different. But what I see happening, I think, is that there's more and more dissatisfaction with the existing structures around measurement and outcomes, and more a sense of like, well, then what, right? So you have now, for the first time, colleges and universities are being held accountable for labor market outcomes, right? That was something that was sort of unheard of 20, 30 years ago, but now is considered pretty routine. I think you have the rise of consumer pay in education systems, and the minute that you have consumers involved, you automatically have some kind of accountability system, right? I think consumers are more engaged in consuming education, whether we're talking about parents in K-12, whether we're talking about students on their own part in the higher ed system or their parents in the higher ed system. I see more and more pressure for this. And so I don't disconnect that from the work, say, that Janine's doing, which I think is really important in terms of measuring this, but there's sort of a meta conversation, I think, happening about outcomes that is, at least to my mind, more encouraging.
Do you see, Trace, that there's going to be a accountability in the K-12 system related to consumerism? Because so far we talk a lot about accountability, but in my world, in reading proficiency, there really haven't been any changes since No Child Left Behind.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you were talking before about the pandemic, and I think there's some really scary stuff that's happening as a result of the pandemic, but I think what you are seeing for the first time is sort of a level of engagement from parents in what their kids are experiencing and doing in schools that goes beyond what we've seen before. So we've seen all kinds of new experimental systems. We've seen people opting out of the public school system. All of that to me is in furtherance of better outcomes. And so it's not to say that it's not going to be messy or that it's all positive necessarily. I don't think that it is. It's sort of complicated and a little scary. But when I see parents making, sort of pulling big levers like that says, wait a minute, I'm not satisfied with what my children are experiencing in the school system. I want something different for them. and I can't afford a private school, but maybe I'm going to pursue some kind of a pod, or I'm going to leave them in public school, but I'm going to pursue tutoring, or I'm going to pursue digital products that I think are beneficial, and I'm going to shop around for those and figure out which ones are best. Like, all of that to me is, I think, part of this larger conversation about outcomes and efficacy, and I can't see that that doesn't, at some level, help put more pressure on the more traditional education structures to do better.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make another plug for making sure students and parents are able to see their own data. Because we think about data belonging to a school, or we think about data being part of an education technology product. And what has really changed during the pandemic is that parents have been sitting right next to their children when they've been going to class. And they're seeing all of the software they use, and they see the instruction happening. And so for the first time, parents are saying, wait a minute, maybe he's doing better than I thought, or maybe he's not doing as well as I thought. And being able to really understand the data that reflects the outcomes that their own child is getting, I'm very hopeful that that's going to be a big lever, as Trace said, in moving us forward.
When we all have these devices in our pockets, and a lot of the apps on these devices nudge us with reminders to do things, and reminders with data that end up motivating us. So why shouldn't we use that elsewhere? Okay, I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but we'll do a last lightning round. Look into your crystal ball. 5 years from now, how will the EdTech sector and how will EdTech companies measure and report on impact and efficacy? Okay, Jonathan is switching it up. Ray, start with you, and we'll come back this way.
I mean, it's a great question. I think you will see that kind of knowledge gain and scale isn't enough. And I think, Trace, to your point earlier, that there's really going to be a look at how are these interventions moving the needle on real outcomes for students. And that's the work we're committed to at EVERFI.
For me, I think it's going to be, it's what I said before, I think it's the growth of the consumer, right? I think you have consumers that have, some people who work in education hate that word, so I just sort of apologize in advance, but students, learners, the people that are using their hard-earned cash to try to learn something or help their children learn something to improve their lives in some way that they understand, those folks are getting more and more engaged. And I think 5 years from now, that's only going to be more true. And you're going to have situations where, people are going to be making choices about improving their prospects in the labor market by by purchasing learning products, purchasing EdTech. They're going to be doing that on behalf of their children. They're going to be engaged with their teachers in school, saying, hey, we use this product at home. Maybe you should use this product in the classroom. We think it works. If you don't think it works, then show me something better, or tell me why you think it doesn't work. Like, I think those conversations are going to be happening more and more, and I think that's exciting.
I agree with all of that. I think we're also going to see an increase in states quantifying what we refer to as soft skills. So those things like being able to work in teams and grit and persistence and all of those kinds of things that we started talking about way back in the 90s with the first SCANS report on education. And we're now kind of circling back to that and social emotional learning. So I think we're going to learn how to quantify those things a little bit better and make sure they're a part of explicit teaching and learning in schools.
So I guess maybe on my side it gets a little easier because we work with the workforce. And so it's very clear, I guess, in some ways, what the impact and the outcome is. Obviously, at the end of the day, we want learners to be successful. But I think there's many different ways to think about what that success means. So on one hand, I think if you talk to the corporation, the outcomes that they would be looking for is recruiting costs, retention. Are they building more skills? Do they have the skills of tomorrow? Are they building a more sustainable business? So we're going to be measuring those type of outcomes, hopefully, and how education impacts that. You'll also be measuring around kind of, I think obviously the RISE does this as well with your Y analytics. Right? What's the lifetime value of somebody that has an education? What does that impact? What's the generational impact of somebody that has now a college degree versus somebody that never had a chance to do that? So we were measuring that as an outcome as well of that broader chance of you're providing folks. I think for corporations, they'll also look at DE&I, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion. right? And so how is education playing a role in that? And how are they doing on their own DEI metrics and driving more equity in their organization, right? Because we know inherently for a lot of organizations, their first rung, people are coming in with an equal access to education, right? So how is the corporation helping to level that playing field? So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of those measurements on the corporation side as they think about impact. And then from a learner perspective, of course, we always look at graduation and are people completing. But more so, I think we're going to look at things like debt avoided. Right? So it's one thing to say you can go get an education, but if you're saddled with a lot of debt, that doesn't really help. Right? But if you can go through and say, you sit around the dinner table and say, hey, I need to go do something better for my career. I want to go get an education. How do I do it? And the conversation is not, oh, can I go borrow money? Can I take on the debt? But hey, let me go work at Aramark, Starbucks, LabCorp, right? They're going to pay for my education. I'm going to earn a living while I'm doing it. And that makes a huge difference from a trajectory around your long-term wealth and your long-term income, right? And so how do we start measuring that and demonstrating that of the role that by having a corporation do what is in their best interest, which is investing in their people, they're driving societal benefits and learner benefits, and that's basically going to be transformative for society. So I think those are some of the ways that we're going to start seeing, I hope, us seeing how impact's measured across the board, because ultimately that's, I think, what we're all here to do, which is to get more people the skills and education they need so that we can all be a better society.
I do hope in workforce learning that as corporations are able to see the ROI, they'll lean into the investments in learning and development. And I do believe and hope that as districts become armed with better tools to watch student usage and efficacy of the EdTech products in which they invest, there will be more buying decisions that will be made based upon that criteria on the efficacy and the outcomes, which has been difficult and a little bit more opaque for districts to do historically. We have time for probably a few questions. Are there folks in the audience who have questions for our panelists? Don't all jump up at once. Can you keep asking? Oh, sorry.
I'll offer one real quickly. So if you rewind back to the exchange between Janine and Trace, by the way, really engaging and inspiring conversations. Cool to see, hear things going on. So rewind to that piece about getting performance data in front of parents and kids, really important. And improving consumerism, really important. And I think we see evidence of those things going on. So what about all that with marginalized families? So in the name of equity, where the family doesn't have capacity to be better consumers, even though tools are there. And, just fixing Wi-Fi with, and the infrastructure plan that may or may not pass the House won't solve all that. There's a capacity issue. So any insights into that at all?
And maybe you could repeat the question as you answer it.
So I was stuck between...
No. Them repeat the question so that
The guys with the mics, yeah.
So I think Janine and Trace, Janine, if you want to pick it up about the equity issue.
So the question was, how do we help marginalized families? If we're thinking about consumerism, for lack of a better word, and how that impacts what families do in the education system and how that drives improvement, what about the families that are marginalized? Did I get that right? Okay, great. And so, I think a lot about this right now. I don't know if folks have been following the missing children lately. We're seeing in some states up to 20% of children's just MIA. We don't know where they are. They disappeared at the beginning of the pandemic and never enrolled. Kindergarten registration across the entire country is down 10%. So the students who should have started school haven't. And so I think about this a lot. Those families are still going to need really intentional outreach. The hope is that the folks who do have the wherewithal to be more demanding of the system are going to push the system to be better. And if school systems start seeing each of those students as potentially impacting their bottom line, if your kindergarten enrollment is down 10%, you better go find those kids, because your revenue for your kindergarten class is also going to be down 10%. And the number of teachers you can have in each of your schools is going to be reduced. So just by virtue of the fact that those marginalized students are missing is going to be an impetus for school leaders to find the students so they can protect their revenue. And normally we don't see this sort of shift in population unless it's a company town where a large employer suddenly boards up and moves. But now, every single school district in the country has to make sure they're finding each of these students, or they're going to be missing large chunks of revenues, which could have the impact of having to lay off teachers and doing things that they don't want to do. And that's a really crass way of looking at it, but that is the reality that we're starting to see. And I've talked with superintendents across the country, and this is what they're telling me. I need to find these kids, or I'm going to have to lay off teachers.
Chase, did you have a comment on the relative access to broadband and how that might influence who's influencing the questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an excellent point. I think having broadband access, everywhere is absolutely one of the ways that helps get solved. I mean, I'm personally encouraged because I don't think there's a single company that operates in this sector that doesn't take the issue of equity really seriously, which is a little bit of a Pollyannish answer, I suppose. But I do think that as an industry, we're really focused on that issue. So I don't discount the ability of all of those families to participate in this sort of consumer revolution that I was describing. But, are there things that we can do collectively, or things government can do to support that further? Absolutely.
I've got a question about government. So as you look into your crystal balls, do you think we'll see rising regulation 5 years from now? There's certainly been letters that have been sent by folks in the Senate to big tech companies and to EdTech companies asking about student data privacy. What do you think is the future of regulation? Actually, Trace, why don't you take it first?
He's baiting me. Yeah, I would say that if I was a betting man, I would say the bet for more regulation is probably a pretty safe one. Listen, it comes from a good place. Everybody wants to see people better protected and better cared for. I think it's almost inevitable. I think. Listen, I don't know. I think what's important for the folks that are operating in this world of EdTech and trying to invest in areas of growth in education is to just be mindful of the fact that you can't, this is not like other tech industries or other places where you can kind of blithely proceed along your plan without thinking about regulatory structures. I've been in dozens of meetings with really smart, bright, motivated folks that are doing things, and then I ask them whether they understand that they need to be registered with the appropriate education bodies in their state, and they look at me blankly like, what does that have to do with us? And so that's kind of my answer to that question, is that for good reasons or bad reasons, government is part of this sector, and if you're operating in this sector, no matter what you're doing, no matter how innovative it is, you have to bring them along, or they're going to come around and kind of resent you later. So,
the state governments are constitutionally responsible for the education of children, so they have to regulate it. It's what they have to do, and I really think that some regulations are good. What we're seeing in reading right now is regulations that provide for making sure we're aligning with the science of reading, and that by and large is good. So, I don't see increasing regulation as inherently bad, as long as it makes good sense.
And that's the stick. How about the carrot? How's the stimulus money going to be used? Some of it in Race to the Top did go to research and evaluation frameworks, but I don't know, Ray, whether you're seeing the benefits.
I was going to go back to the earlier question just about under-resourced communities, and I think it goes a little bit to what you're asking, John, is I think the federal government can step in, but I think at the end of the day, the private sector is going to need to continue to step up, and there's going to need to be a huge private sector response. How do you democratize access to a quality education, whether you're at school or at home? And we have the opportunity and the honor to work with the top 100 school districts in the country. And when the pandemic hit, the first phone calls that we got were, we're focused on feeding our kids at school. So we're worried about food insecurity, and then it's access to technology, access to the infrastructure. And so I think ultimately you're going to need infrastructure underneath students. You've got digital curriculum, but what is the infrastructure that you can put underneath them to make sure that they're successful, and you're going to have to do that with the private sector.
And on that note, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Ray and Trace and Janine and Jonathan.